The road to Dineta stretched like a scar across the earth, endless and empty. I drove for hours under a sky so wide, it seemed intent on swallowing me whole. The land was a palette of ochres and reds, sun-baked mesas stacked in solemn layers of ancient time. Nothing moved but the wind, which whispered through dry brush and carried with it the faint smell of iron and sage. It was the kind of silence that unnerves you after a while, too perfect and too deliberate. But I wasn't the kind of man to be frightened by the desert, or by the people who claimed it spoke back. My name is Dr. Andrew Barnes, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago, and I'd come to New Mexico for one reason: to collect first-hand accounts of Navajo spiritual traditions for a forthcoming paper on symbolic continuity in indigenous mythic systems. The department was expecting something groundbreaking, something that could turn oral superstition into academic gold. I'd been warned by colleagues that the Diné people were guarded about their sacred beliefs, especially anything concerning skinwalkers, sand paintings, or what they called forbidden pigments. That was precisely what drew me here. The line between anthropology and folklore was always thinner than people like to admit, and I intended to step across it, with my eyes open. The reservation road ended at a small settlement. Half a dozen houses clung to the dusty valley, their walls bleached by the sun. When I parked and stepped out, a group of children stopped playing to stare at me. Dark eyes fixed, unreadable. An old dog barked once from under a porch. Every door I knocked on was met with silence. Every polite greeting died in the same wary stare. No one wanted to talk, until I met Elder Chayton. He sat outside his hogan beneath a tattered awning, carving what looked like a wooden prayer stick. His face was lined deeply, carved with the same wind that shaped the cliffs around us. When I introduced myself, he said nothing for a long while, simply studying me as though measuring my shadow against the earth. "You are looking for the painted man," he said finally. I froze. "You've heard of him?" "Everyone here has heard, but we try not to talk about him." There was something about the way he said it that unsettled me. Calm, factual, as though reciting a weather report. But I pressed on, explaining my research, my interest in comparative myth, the cultural context of pigments and ceremonial art. He listened, expressionless, and when I finished, he only shook his head. "You think we paint for beauty? That's not true. We paint for balance. Every color is alive. Every mark has a purpose." The painted man broke that purpose. I asked who he was, what he had done, and Chayton's gaze drifted toward the mesas, where the sun had begun to slide low, bleeding red light across the sand. "Long ago, a man stole sacred pigments from the Hozo ceremony," he said. "He used them to make his own painting, to give himself power. The gods punished him. The paint sank into his flesh. Now it lives there, and waits for others who do not respect its rules." He reached into his satchel and handed me a small pouch tied with sinew. Inside was a red powder that glimmered faintly in the dying light. "Carry this with you," he said. "Red ochre. It is the only pigment he cannot take." I wanted to ask why, but he began reciting something under his breath. An old prayer, rhythmic and low. Then, he fixed me with those pale cataract eyes and told me the rules. "There are only 4 you must remember," he said. "Never look directly at the painted symbols. If you see them, close your eyes. Carry the ochre always. If you hear brushstrokes on canvas when no one is there, do not go looking. And never leave drawings in this desert unfinished. The painted man will finish them, and then he will come for you." I scribbled the rules down in my notebook, half intrigued, half amused. It was good material, perfect for the living mythos section of my paper. He spoke of these things with such conviction. It almost seemed rehearsed. When I stood to leave, he reached out suddenly and gripped my wrist. His hand was shockingly cold. "Do not stay here for too long," he said softly. "He always comes for those who stay longer than they should." That night, I made camp on the ridge overlooking the dry basin. The moon rose pale and indifferent over the desert, lighting up the red stones like embers. I unpacked my recorder, my field notes, my maps, tools of the rational world. Yet even as I worked, I caught myself glancing toward the dark horizon where the mesas loomed, their edges painted black against the stars. For a moment, I thought I saw movement down there, something pale shifting between the stones. But when I looked again, it was gone. By morning, the desert seemed less ominous, smaller somehow, reduced to heat, rock, and the slow hum of cicadas. Night always exaggerates things. Rational daylight has a way of bleaching fear out of a place, leaving it bare and unremarkable. I woke early, brushed the sand from my tent, and brewed instant coffee on my small gas stove. The taste was bitter and metallic, but comforting. I caught myself glancing at the little pouch of red ochre sitting beside my notebook. The Elder's protection. The powder looked like rust, dry and harmless. I almost laughed at how sincerely he'd insisted on its importance. Superstition thrives in isolation, I reminded myself. Out here, under the enormous weight of silence and time, the mind invents monsters to make sense of emptiness. I spent most of the day documenting the nearby petroglyphs, spirals, zigzags, and hunting figures etched into sandstone. The sun was merciless, baking the back of my neck, but the work felt grounding. Every stroke of my pencil across the page returned me to something solid. I cataloged the symbols, estimated their age, compared them to Hopi variants, made notes on stylistic transitions. Order, reason, precision. That was my defense against myth. At noon, I found myself near a dry riverbed where the ground turned darker, almost charred. There, partially buried in the dust, lay an old wooden frame. Its canvas had rotted away long ago, leaving only splinters and the faint smell of pigment. Something about it drew me in. It might have been the way the wood seemed stained. Faint traces of green and black color that hadn't faded, even under years of sun. I crouched, examining it with my magnifier. The paint almost seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of the grain, as if still wet. The painted man will finish them. The phrase drifted through my thoughts like sand through fingers. I shook it off, stood, and photographed the frame from multiple angles. Whatever myth it represented, it was clearly part of some lost ritual practice. Material culture, evidence of artistic transgression, perfect for publication. By late afternoon, the heat began to waver into mirage. Shadows lengthened and warped the landscape. I drove into town for water and fuel, and again found the settlement quiet. The same children stared at me, unblinking. I offered one of them a granola bar, but the boy only shook his head and ran. The horizon burned orange, the kind of light that makes everything appear ancient, fossilized. I prepared my notes for the night, recording observations into my tape recorder. Day 2, field survey continues. Local accounts align with classic myth formation. Territorial fear reinforced by isolation and oral repetition. There is no physical evidence of any painted entities. Myth as cultural deterrent. As I spoke, the words reassured me. They rebuilt my certainty layer by layer. That evening, I even unpacked my sketchbook and began to draw the ridge line, tracing the curves of the mesa under fading light. It felt innocent, meditative, like capturing a landscape before it dissolved into night. When I finished, I left the drawing half done, planning to complete it in the morning. I didn't remember the elder's warning until much later. Do not leave drawings in this desert unfinished. I laughed quietly to myself. Superstitions, all of it. Paint that moved, curses that lived in color. Beautiful nonsense meant to protect stories from outsiders like me. When I crawled into my tent that night, the desert wind sighed softly through the sagebrush, a dry, whispering rhythm that almost resembled breath. I closed my eyes, unbothered, convinced that by simply not believing, I was safe. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the sand shifted, and then fell still again. The morning began as all desert mornings do. Gray light spilling slowly over a brittle horizon, the air cold and sharp, the silence heavier than sleep. I woke with the uneasy feeling that something had shifted around me during the night. My notebook had slid halfway out of the tent, and my sketch from the previous evening lay beside it, completed, not merely filled in, but finished. The ridge line I had drawn, was now surrounded by dozens of new strokes. Sinuous lines, spirals, and sharp branching patterns that hadn't existed when I closed my eyes. They were layered in such a way that I couldn't tell if they represented shadow, smoke, or something alive. The pigments shimmered faintly, as though still wet, and the air above the paper smelled faintly of turpentine and dust. For a moment, I froze, staring at the patterns, confused, trying to remember if I'd worked in my sleep. But even half awake, my technique had never produced strokes so fine, so precise. There was something intentional in those lines, something aware. The elder's voice echoed in the back of my mind. "Do not leave drawings in this desert unfinished." A small tremor went through me. I reached out, meaning to tear the page away, but stopped. The light shifted, and for the briefest instant, I thought the lines were moving. My breath caught. The ink, or what I thought was ink, seemed to ripple beneath the paper's surface, as though alive, adjusting itself. The curves flexed, like sinew beneath translucent skin. I blinked, and the motion stopped. I told myself it was the heat, the way mirage distorts perception. And then, very faintly, I heard it, the sound of a brushstroke, a soft, deliberate drag, bristles sliding over canvas, distant but distinct. My pulse quickened. I stood abruptly, scanning the camp. Nothing moved except the dry reeds by the water drum. Still, the sound continued, a slow rhythm, as though someone was painting. My rational mind fractured against the silence. I turned toward the riverbed, toward the spot where I'd found that old wooden frame the day before. The wind was motionless, the sand unmarked, but I could feel that the sound was coming from there, faint and constant. I took a few steps toward it before stopping myself. "If you hear brushstrokes on canvas when no one is around," the elder had warned, "do not investigate." I forced a shaky laugh, muttered to the empty air, "This is absurd," and kept moving anyway. Each step made the sound clearer, the brush sliding faster, harder now, as though the unseen artist were racing to finish before being seen. When I reached the place, the wooden frame was gone. In its place was a flat stone, smooth as glass, its surface covered in dark yellow pigment. The designs were geometric at first glance, but as I crouched to inspect them, my stomach turned. They were faces, human faces, half-formed and distorted, emerging from one another, their eyes hollow, their mouths smeared open, and beneath them, faintly, the outline of something like a man. Tall, hunched, his body covered in lines that bent, twisted, and spiraled into the ground. My fingers trembled. I leaned closer, and then, without realizing it, I looked directly at the symbols. They began to move, not flickering or shifting, but writhing, like the surface of the stone itself was softening under heat. The painted man's head tilted upward. His eyes, two black voids, rolled open and met mine. A pulse of nausea struck me, so strong I almost vomited. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming to look away, but something in that gaze held me there, paralyzed, caught in the impossible pull of movement. When I finally tore my eyes shut, the world spun. I don't remember how long I stayed that way, kneeling in the dust, eyes closed, shaking. My breath came ragged, and in the darkness behind my lids, I saw afterimages of the symbols. White outlines, pulsing faintly. When I dared open my eyes again, the stone was blank, empty. The pigment was gone, as though it had never existed. Only a faint shimmer remained, vanishing as the sunlight grew stronger. I stumbled back to camp, my heart pounding, trying to anchor myself in something familiar. I grabbed the pouch of red ochre and held it in my hand, though I didn't know why. All day I tried to work, but the desert seemed to lean closer now, watching. The silence between gusts of wind felt thicker, weighted with something unsaid. That night, the desert changed. The air lost its dryness. It felt damp, heavy, as though the sand had absorbed something it shouldn't have. The wind came in short, uneven breaths that rattled the walls of my tent, like the desert itself was whispering. I told myself it was the shifting temperature, the usual turbulence before dawn, yet deep down, something in that pattern felt intentional. I was reading through my field notes when I heard it again. The brushstroke. Soft and measured, like bristles dragging through thick paint. It came from just beyond the tent flap. First, I froze. Every muscle in my body tightened. My eyes flicked toward the pouch of red ochre lying on my bedroll, its faint scent of clay strangely comforting. I tried to reason it away. Maybe it was an insect or the creak of dry grass against canvas. But then came the second sound, longer, that steady, pulsing rhythm, like an unseen hand at work. I whispered to myself, "Don't investigate," repeating the elder's warning as if it were a prayer. But curiosity, that fatal arrogance, rose stronger than caution. I wanted to see. I told myself that documenting the phenomenon was essential. A sound like this, so precise, it had to have a rational cause. So I reached for my flashlight. When I unzipped the tent, the desert greeted me with silence. Even the crickets had stopped singing. My beam of light cut through the night in thin, trembling slices. I swept it across the camp. The cooler, the folding chair, my pack, all as I'd left them. The wind had stilled completely, and in that unnatural quiet, my heartbeat sounded thunderous. Then came another stroke. The sound came from behind the jeep. I circled toward it, each step leaving an echo on the hardened ground. The beam quivered against metal, then caught something that shouldn't have been there. A half-painted canvas, propped against the side of the jeep, where there had been nothing before. It was large, nearly 4 feet across, made of rough animal hide stretched on a wooden frame. My light trembled over it, revealing a shape still in progress. Lines of black and yellow paint, forming the upper half of a human figure. The body was lean and long, almost skeletal, its proportions wrong. The skin was painted in swirling patterns, layered in spirals and jagged edges that looked alive under the trembling light. And where its face should have been, nothing but a smear of pigment. My breath caught in my throat. Someone or something had been painting this here. I knelt, studying the paint. It glistened wetly in the beam, thick and glue-like. The smell hit me next. Iron and smoke, unmistakably organic. I stumbled backward, my light jerking. Something moved across the surface of the canvas. It was faint, but I saw it. A brushstroke appearing on its own. The bristles invisible, the motion clear. A single stroke from right to left, drawn by an unseen hand. Then another, tracing the outline of a jaw. My body went cold. Whatever had been painting this was still here. The sound of the brush returned, now all around me, circling, echoing through the open desert like invisible whispers. Each stroke felt faster, more frantic, as though the artist had been interrupted and was racing to finish before I could interfere. I turned, meaning to run back to the tent, but my flashlight flickered out. In the dark, I could still see the painting. Inside my eyes, seared into my retinas, the half-formed figure writhing, shifting, lines twisting over its flesh, as though it were painting itself. I stumbled blindly through the dark, tripping over my own pack. My hands hit the sand, and in the absence of sight, I heard the brush lifting from the canvas. Then, a whisper. "You looked once. That was enough." The voice was dry, cracking, like paint flaking off old wood. By dawn, the canvas was gone. Only a thin layer of red dust remained, fine as ash, glimmering faintly where the painting had stood. I had almost convinced myself that fatigue and isolation were to blame for everything. The moving sketches, the pulsing symbols, a brushstroke appearing on its own. I told myself it was the exhaustion of fieldwork, the price of chasing folklore through too much heat and too little sleep. But beneath that thin layer of reason, something restless stirred. An irritant in the mind, the way grit gets under the eyelid and refuses to be blinked away. I needed more information about this damned painted man. So, after a brief breakfast, I packed my notebook, camera, and drove toward the nearest settlement, a small Navajo community scattered across the mesas. I stopped first at a gas station, little more than a faded structure half sunk in sand. Inside, a young woman was arranging cigarette cartons behind the counter. I introduced myself politely, explaining that I was conducting anthropological research on Navajo cosmology. When I mentioned the painted man, she froze mid-motion. Her hands stilled on the cardboard. For a moment, the only sound was the buzzing of the ceiling fan. Then she said, in a voice so low it nearly vanished into the air, "Don't ask about him." Before I could press further, she stepped into the back room and did not return. I tried elsewhere, a roadside diner, an old trading post, even a family repairing a fence near the highway. Every time, the same reaction. Eyes dropping, shoulders tensing, polite silence collapsing into avoidance. A few made subtle gestures, drawing small protective shapes in the dust, or muttering words under their breath. One elderly man spat into the sand and walked away. By late afternoon, frustration had begun to erode my restraint. I was trained to deal with reluctance in the field. Cultures guarding their stories were nothing new to me, but this wasn't secrecy born of reverence. It was fear. At last, I found an old man sitting outside a wooden shack, his face a weathered map of sun and time. He watched me approach without moving, the smoke of his pipe curling in the still air. His gaze was calm but unyielding, as if he had already decided how much of me he could tolerate. I greeted him respectfully, introduced myself, and once again began my practiced explanation. He listened without comment. When I said the words "painted man," he tapped the pipe against a stone, emptied the ash, and muttered something in Navajo. "He walks with colors that don't belong to him," he said finally, switching to English. "The gods stripped him of his name and gave him another. He paints what should not be painted, and he watches those who try to remember." He fixed me with a long stare, his eyes pale and clouded with age. "You see something moving on the rock?" "Yes," I admitted before thinking. "Then you already looked too long." He rose with slow movement, went inside, and returned with a small cloth pouch, the color of dried blood. He pressed it into my hand. "Red ochre," he said. "He cannot touch that color." I asked if he would tell me more, who the painted man truly was, what the curse meant, whether there were others who had seen him. But an old man only shook his head. Words bring him closer. Before I left, I turned to ask one last question. Something foolish and stubborn. "Have you ever seen him?" The old man didn't answer. He lifted his shirt sleeve, just enough for me to glimpse his forearm. Faded markings ran along his skin, symbols blurred by age, almost erased. But one of them twitched ever so slightly when the wind passed over it. I drove back to camp with a second pouch of ochre in my pocket, the sun descending in bands of copper and shadow. The desert had turned bronze in the setting sun, long shadows cutting the sand into lines and symbols of their own. Wind whispered over the rocks, stirring dust that glowed faintly in the last light. I wanted to capture it, to make sense of it, to claim some part of what I'd witnessed. That, after all, was the anthropologist's task: to document, to define, to translate mystery into knowledge. So I began to sketch. It started as a crude outline of the canyon walls, the way their surfaces curved inward like the ribs of an enormous creature. Then, I added the faint symbols I'd seen carved into the stone. My pencil worked with mechanical certainty, tracing the grooves from memory. The more I drew, the more the lines seemed to guide my hand, as though the stone itself remembered better than I did. The marks began to tangle and interlock in bizarre patterns. Circles turned into eyes, strokes became mouths, curves opened into a shape vaguely human, vaguely screaming. The desert outside had gone still, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, that I was letting my imagination run away, but my hand kept moving, faster now, the pencil dragging furiously over the paper. The dry rasp of graphite began to change. It thickened, deepened, turning wet, as though I were brushing over canvas soaked in oil. Then I realized I could hear brushstrokes. Somewhere behind me, faint and deliberate, the sound of bristles dragging through paint. I froze, remembering the elder's third rule. But I wasn't breaking that one. I was just drawing. I looked down. My sketch was incomplete. A body without arms, a head without nose. Something urged me to finish it, some irrational magnetic pull to make it whole. My pencil trembled above the paper, and in the periphery of my vision, the air seemed to ripple. A faint smell of turpentine and ash filled the tent. My flashlight flickered, casting the world in stuttering frames, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in those gaps of darkness. A long skeletal hand, dragging a brush across the tent fabric from the outside. I dropped the pencil. The moment it left my hand, the tent went dead quiet. When I dared to look back down, my sketchbook had changed. The drawing was complete now. A figure standing in the desert, its body covered in writhing symbols. Its head was tilted, the mouth a perfect void. Around it stretched the same sandstone formations I had drawn hours earlier. Except one detail was new. In the corner of the page, near the figure's feet, was a smaller outline. Human-shaped, kneeling, holding a notebook. It was me. The page felt warm beneath my fingertips, faintly pulsing. I slammed the notebook shut and stumbled outside, gulping the cool night air like it could wash the images out of my head. Above, the sky was a smear of stars. The wind had returned, whispering faintly across the mesa, the soft hiss of brushes moving across a surface. In my pocket, the pouch of red ochre throbbed gently, like a heartbeat. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sketch, the one I swore I'd never look at again. The image of that painted figure lingered behind my eyelids, like a stain I couldn't blink away. Even with the notebook zipped tight inside my pack, I could feel it humming faintly in the dark, as though the lines I'd drawn were still rearranging themselves when I wasn't watching. In the morning, wind carried a faint metallic tang, paint and blood, and when I stepped outside my tent, the world had already changed. The canyon walls were no longer bare. Across their surface, faint markings shimmered under the morning sun. Painted, swirls and angular shapes, circles intersecting lines, human silhouettes with empty heads. They looked almost translucent, as though some invisible artist had brushed pigment across the stone with strokes of air. The moment my shadow fell upon the wall, the symbols moved. Only slightly, a twitch, a shift, like the wall was breathing beneath its paint. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my smartphone. The marks stilled again, returning to their fragile stillness, but the impression of life remained. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning the whisper of the wind. The elder's warning came back to me, vivid and cold. Never look directly at the strange painted symbols. If you glimpse them, close your eyes immediately. I had broken the first rule days ago, and now the desert was showing me the cost. When I turned back toward camp, I noticed the next sign of corruption. My tent, its fabric, once a dull beige, was now marred with faint gray strokes, jagged, looping marks that pulsed with faint color when the sunlight hit them. I knelt closer. The symbols had been painted from the inside. The realization sank like a stone in my gut. My breath caught in my throat. I crawled into the tent slowly, half expecting to see someone crouched inside, brush in hand, but it was empty. The only sound was the steady hum of wind passing through the nylon. And then, as I moved, the symbols changed again. My hand brushed against one of the painted marks, and it brightened, glowing faintly as if responding to the warmth of my skin. I snatched my hand back, the light dimmed. I reached forward again, and it returned, pulsing faster this time. The realization chilled me to the marrow. These marks were responding to me. It felt like recognition. I stepped back out of the tent, heart pounding, forcing myself to think rationally, to measure what was happening instead of surrendering to fear. Yet as I stood there, I noticed something that broke any illusion of reason. The ground beneath my feet was covered in small dried streaks of pigment, white and black, trailing away from the tent toward the canyon wall. The strokes were long and deliberate. I crouched down and touched the soil. The lines were bled through it, seeping deeper, like veins under skin. When I brushed them, the earth quivered slightly, just enough for me to feel movement. I pulled my hand back, my breath sharp. My heart thudded so loudly that I didn't notice, at first, that the air had gone still. The entire desert was listening. Then I heard it again, the sound of painting. Not from the canyon walls, but all around. Faint rhythmic brushstrokes, circling the camp in widening rings. I spun, looking for movement, but there was none. The sand remained undisturbed. The sound, though, grew stronger, brush against skin, stroke by stroke. And as I backed toward my tent, I realized that the painted symbols on its fabric were no longer faint. They were bright now, slick and black, shifting like ink underwater, and forming something new. My hand, painted perfectly, down to the small scar near my thumb from a long-forgotten cut. The lines of pigment curled up the tent fabric, reaching toward me as if remembering. I grabbed the pouch of red ochre from my pocket, the one I'd nearly forgotten. The moment my fingers touched it, the sound outside faltered. The air shuddered, then went silent again. I could feel the energy recoil from the pouch, like oil meeting flame. That was when I understood. The ochre was a barrier, the only one left between me and whatever had learned to paint me. I zipped the pouch tight into my jacket and stepped away from the tent. The sun was beginning to drop toward the horizon, bleeding amber light across the sand. I caught the faintest glimpse of a shape far across the desert. A figure standing against the wind, its surface gleaming with color, its limbs flickering like brushstrokes in motion. The next morning, I woke to find my hands trembling. At first, I thought it was exhaustion. Nights of poor sleep and a mind knotted with superstition. But when I reached for my canteen, I froze. There, across the back of my left hand, was a faint gray smear. It looked like dust or ash, except it was beneath the skin, as though it had been painted inside me. When I rubbed at it, the shape didn't fade. It pulsed. A dull molten ache flared beneath the surface, and I snatched my hand back with a hiss. The lines spread with each heartbeat. I stumbled out of my tent, half crazed and half still dreaming. The desert air cut through me, cold, dry, unyielding. Sunlight clawed across the canyon walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces forming in the rock, their expressions carved in pigment instead of stone. My tent still bore the marks from yesterday, but they'd grown darker overnight, the symbols thickening, swelling outward as if they were breathing. And my own body, it was joining them. By midday, the markings had crawled up my forearm in curling arcs, merging with the veins beneath my skin. Each new pattern seared its way into me, slow as fire under glass. I tried washing them off in the basin near camp, but when I poured the water, it hissed. The liquid recoiled from the paint like oil from acid, beating on the surface of my arm before sliding off in black streaks. The pain came next, sharp and pulsing. I could feel it painting itself deeper. Every instinct in me wanted to run. But where? The canyon rim was miles off. The truck sat dead from the heat. That was no hallucination. I was shaking too hard to write. Still, I forced myself to record what I could. My notes from that time are a mess. Half sentences, frantic scrawls, some written in jagged lines that slope across the page. The paint is alive. It moves when I breathe. I think he's inside the color. I tried to hold to something academic. Living pigment sounded absurd. Yet here it was, drawing its map across my flesh. I thought of the legend again. The man who stole sacred paint and became what he feared most. The symbols had consumed him, replacing blood with color. I didn't want to believe it, but part of me knew I was being rewritten in the same script. By evening, I was delirious. My hands blazed from within, heat rippling beneath the skin like molten glass. I tore open the pouch of red ochre the elder had given me and smeared it across my wrists, my palms, my chest. The relief was instant. The pain lessened, the crawling stopped. The marks seemed to shrink back, trembling as if afraid of the pigment. The ochre was working. It was the only thing that could keep it at bay. But the cost was time. The ochre was drying fast, and I could already feel the heat returning. The symbols shimmered beneath the thin, coating like embers under ash. That's when I saw movement. At the edge of camp, just beyond the perimeter of my lantern's light, something stirred. A tall, thin figure leaned against the canyon wall. Its skin, or what should have been skin, was covered in color. Black, yellow, and white, all twisting like oil on water. His surface shifted constantly, patterns swimming under translucent flesh. His limbs moved like paint dragged across canvas, stretching, distorting, until his whole body seemed a living brushstroke. The closer he came, the more the air shimmered with pigment, the smell of linseed oil and blood thickening in my throat. And his face, if you could call it that, was the worst of all. It was painted into him. The colors sank and bled through, forming and dissolving with each movement. Sometimes I thought I saw eyes, sometimes only black smears. But every time I blinked, I saw my own face flicker there, faint but growing stronger. He was painting me onto himself. I stumbled backward, clutching the ochre to my chest, shouting words that made no sense, begging the air to hold steady. The painted man didn't stop. He reached toward me with one shifting hand, and where his fingers brushed the air, color spread, dark yellow and bone white, dripping upward. I turned and ran. My breath tore at my throat as I stumbled across the sand, every shadow pulsing with painted life. The walls around me were alive now, crawling with symbols that followed me. By the time I reached the elders' settlement, my legs were shaking so violently I could barely stand. I collapsed outside his hut, my hands blazing with symbols, my vision splitting into bands of color and heat. He appeared in the doorway, his face pale, eyes burning with something between pity and fear. "You looked too long," he whispered, "and you drew his likeness." I could barely speak. "Help me." He nodded once, grimly, and reached for a small clay bowl filled with sand. He pressed it into my shaking hands. "Then listen," he said, "there is one more rule." He leaned close, his breath dry against my ear. "If paint appears on your skin, bury yourself in sand before dawn." I stared at him, trembling. Bury myself? He didn't answer. He simply pointed toward the desert, where the horizon was beginning to blacken. I stumbled into the desert as the elder's words burned through my head. The ochre on my skin was flaking away, brittle as dried blood. Each time a piece fell, the markings beneath it pulsed brighter, curling like veins of molten glass beneath my flesh. The sand shifted beneath my boots, whispering, swallowing, until I dropped to my knees. There was no reason to think it would work. No logic, no science. But instinct drove me forward. I clawed at the desert floor, digging frantically. The grains were cold at first, then warmer as I sank deeper. I dug until my arms trembled, until my fingers bled, until the marks on my skin began to hum in response to some rhythm I could not hear. Then I lay back into the shallow pit. The first touch of sand felt almost gentle, cool against my burning arms. I pulled it over my chest, my legs, my face. It filled my mouth and nose with dust, grounding me in its weight. The heat beneath my skin flared once, violently, and then began to dim. For a moment there was silence. Then a sound, a slow, dragging step. He was close. Through the thin layer of sand over my face, I saw light. Faint, shifting, spectral. The painted man moved like a shadow cast by a dying fire. His colors had changed. They pulsed now with unnatural light. The patterns no longer followed his body. They radiated outward, unfurling like vines across the ground. The paint was seeking me. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and the grains of sand above me began to shimmer, rearranging into symbols that mirrored the ones carved into my flesh. The painted man stopped directly above me. I could feel his presence like wet ink about to touch paper. Through the thin veil of sand, I saw him. Paint dripped and crawled across his skull, forming eyes that refused to stay still, a mouth that smeared and reformed with every breath. His fingers were long brushes, dripping color that hissed where it met the ground. He turned slowly, searching, and each movement painted the air itself. Strokes of burning pigment that hung suspended, before dissolving into mist. The wind rose. The symbols on the canyon walls began to tremble, responding to him. The elder's voice echoed faintly from the camp, chanting words I didn't understand. I realized then what the rule really meant. The sand wasn't meant to protect me. It was meant to hide me from him, to blend me into the unfinished painting that was the desert itself, to let the land take me back before the pigment did. The air split with a sound like tearing canvas. The painted man knelt, his face inches from the ground above mine. I could see the paint dripping down, seeping through the sand, curling toward my skin. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare move. Then, silence. The wind stopped, the symbols froze. For a heartbeat, I thought it was over, until the paint touched me. It burned colder than ice, seeping through the grains, sinking into my mouth, my eyes, my veins. My body convulsed as color filled me, as the world turned into a storm of light and sound. I could see it now, 1,000 faces painted over one another, all screaming soundlessly, trapped in a masterpiece that would never dry. I was becoming part of it. With the last of my strength, I thrust my hands upward, through the sand, reaching for the dawn. I didn't expect light, but it came. A single ray, pale and thin, broke across the horizon. It struck the painted man's face, and for the first time he recoiled. The colors beneath his skin began to crack, bleeding white. The symbols on my arms flared, then split apart into dust. The scream that followed wasn't sound. It was color itself, tearing loose from form. The painted man dissolved into a storm of pigment, scattered into the morning wind, his body unraveling like wet paint in water. And then, darkness. I think I fainted. When I woke, the sun was high, and the elder appeared at the edge of the pit, his sandaled feet silent against the hardened desert floor. His face, weathered and solemn, held a gravity that sent a chill through me far colder than the night ever had. He knelt beside me, brushing away grains of sand that had clung to my arms and hair, revealing raw skin where the marks had vanished. "You are alive," he said softly, almost in disbelief. "But that does not mean it is over." I swallowed hard, still trying to catch my ragged breath. I thought I followed the rule. I buried myself in sand. I did exactly what you said. The elder's dark eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something in them I hadn't noticed before. A glimmer of warning mingled with grief. "You followed the rule, yes, but the painted man, he is older than any law of ours, older than the desert itself. You have touched something beyond mere curses." I flinched as he reached out, picking up a small shard of ochre from the ground. He held it between his fingers, letting the sun catch its deep red hue. "This pigment," he said, "is not just paint. It is the memory of him. Every stroke you have seen, every line that formed upon the canyon walls and your own skin. He leaves it to bind himself to the living world. And now," his hand trembled slightly, "and now he has connected himself to you." I glanced at my left palm, where the single faint spiral pulsed ever so slightly. A shiver ran down my spine. "I don't understand. Why me? Why my skin?" The elder's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because you are like him in a way you do not yet realize. You seek to observe, to record, to capture. You think yourself apart from the world, above its spirits. But your mind hungers for the same permanence the painted man sought. He stole sacred pigment, yes, but what he truly stole was attention, devotion, and the arrogance of those who believed they could contain him. You looked too long, drew too close. You invited him, and now he has memorized the shape of your flesh." I felt a hollow panic settle in my chest, the kind that grows in layers and refuses to dissipate. "Does this mean he'll come back?" The elder nodded slowly, almost sorrowfully. "He will, always. Every line he drew on your arms, every flicker of color in the desert, is a memory. And now he carries yours with him. The next time he seeks to manifest, he will know you, your skin, your form." I swallowed hard, the weight of my arrogance pressing down. All my research, all my meticulous notes, all my insistence on rationality. It had led me here, to the brink, to the very brink of being consumed by something I could not control, by a consciousness older than any mountain or canyon. And yet, The elder continued, "You are still alive. You still carry the pigment of survival. That is the gift and the curse. You cannot outrun him. You can only prepare. You can only respect what you have glimpsed and remember the rules." I clenched my fists, feeling the raw ache of my skin, the echo of the burning paint, and the pulse of the faint spiral beneath my palm. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to erase every memory, to abandon my work, my notes. But I could not. I had seen what others had refused to see. I had walked too close to the sacred, and I had survived. The thought of surrendering my research, my record of the myth, felt like betraying something almost divine. I realized then, with a cold clarity, that the painted man was not just an antagonist. He was a mirror, and the reflection he offered was horrifying because it revealed not only what he was, but what I could become. The elder stood, dusting the sand from his robes. "You have one choice left," he said quietly. "Respect the pigment, respect the rules, or he will find a way to make you permanent. The desert does not forget, and neither does he." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and lifted the small bag of red ochre from my pack. It was my lifeline now, the only barrier between myself and the painted man's obsession. I would follow the rules, I would record my observations, and yet, a part of me could not abandon the hunger that had brought me here in the first place. The wind shifted across the canyon. A faint shimmer on the rocks caught my eye, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw the painted man, standing far across the desert, observing. The pigment in his skin writhed faintly in the morning sun. I shivered and turned my gaze back to the sand at my feet, knowing that my connection to him had changed irreversibly. He had memorized my form, my arrogance, my curiosity, and he would wait. The desert was quiet, but the memory of his brushstrokes lingered in the air, as if the canyon itself had inhaled the colors of my fear and would exhale them only when he chose. Finally, I understood that there was no ending here. Only rules, only vigilance, and the knowledge that the painted man was patient beyond measure.